Good afternoon and welcome back to the 7th Annual International HitLab Innovators Summit. We are so excited to have you joining us here today, and we are so excited to be presenting our next panel discussion. Up next, we would like to welcome summit sponsors AdhereTech, who will be presenting on adherence strategies, transforming patient engagement from clinical trials to commercialization. Our moderator for the panel will be Lyndi Hirsch, Chief Marketing Officer at AdhereTech, an industry leader providing adherence solutions impacting health outcomes through innovative technology and support. Joining our panel will be Dr. Calman Prussin, VP of Clinical and Translational Medicine at Knopp Biosciences. Dr. Prussin is a physician scientist with an expertise in the immunology of allergic disease. Also joining us is Jaymin Mehta, Executive Director of Oncology and Strategy and Operations at Gilead Sciences. Jaymin recently started the new role of Executive Director of Oncology, Strategy and Operations at Gilead Sciences, where he was previously the Executive Director of Inflammation Portfolio Access Marketing. And lastly, but certainly not least, we welcome Jeff Kahout, the Senior Director of Specialty Pharmacy and the leader of the National Account Director team, responsible for managing accounts throughout the AstraZeneca Specialty Pharmacy Network. Jeff joined AstraZeneca in 2004 and has held various leadership roles in sales, commercial operations, marketing, leadership, and team development. We are so honored to have you all here with us today. Thank you so much. Over to you, Lyndi.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introductions. And thank you to the panel for being here today. Jaymin, Calman, and Jeff, really appreciative of your time. We're very excited to be talking about what we do in general to advance the connection of technology to care, specifically focusing on adherence. And what I love about our panel today is that we're going to be talking to three different people who have a different impact along the continuum of care within our overall pharmaceutical business. And so I'm going to ask each person to just talk a little bit about who you are and what you do in just one moment after I make my first announcement, which is at the end of this panel, we will, AdhereTech will have a little virtual exhibit booth that's actually going on throughout the conference, but we'll have some folks there to talk about AdhereTech and any questions if you have anything specifically about our organization, and I'll give a reminder at the end. And we're going to be talking about overall adherence, the impact of adherence, the importance of how new technologies and new ways of thinking about adherence changes our business. Before we get into that, I'm first going to introduce Jaymin and ask him to please just give us a little bit of background about where you're coming from, where you work, what you do there at Gilead.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndi. Hi, everybody. My name is Jaymin Mehta. As the moderator or the host mentioned, I work at Gilead right now and just took a role in global oncology. We've greatly expanded our oncology portfolio this past year. But prior to Gilead, I spent the bulk of my career in the industry, about 20 years, until recently, almost all of it in inline U.S. marketing and sales. Spent the bulk of my career at Abbott and Genentech, and with a little bit of time at Biogen and Amgen as well. Cut my teeth in the field force for about 3-4 years, carrying the bag, and then I went into marketing roles and really cut my teeth in marketing as a patient marketer at both Abbott, Biogen, and Genentech for a long time. So adherence is near and dear to me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you, Jaymin. Really appreciate that. And for some good full disclosure, Jaymin and I did work together at Genentech, highlight of my career. Thank you, being able to work together. I would like to now ask Calman, Dr. Prussin, if you would please just give us a little bit of background about yourself, where you work, what your focus is.
Sure. Hi, Calman Prussin. I'm, as Lyndi mentioned, I'm a physician scientist and involved in drug development, clinical developments. So I work for Knopp Biosciences. So we're a small biopharma company developing our main drug that we're developing at this point is dexpramipexole. So this is a oral eosinophil lowering drug. It's a pill. And so one of the real questions we had is when we're in clinical trials where we want to have a lot of control over that patients take the drug, and it's a twice-a-day drug at this point, is adherence. And we'll talk later about that, but that's how I got involved with AdhereTech, is that desire to have much more clean data as far as adherence and also maximizing adherence, since the drugs we're competing with are injected biologicals. So when you inject a drug, your adherence is essentially 100%. There, you gave it to them in the office. So we wanted to make sure we had good adherence in our studies going forward.
Thank you for that, Dr. Prussin. And so what I would like to do is now go to Jeff. If you could give us a little bit of your background, please.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndi. My name is Jeff Kahoot, and I work for AstraZeneca. I've been with AstraZeneca for about 17 years. And like Jaymin, I've had much of my career across the commercial organization between sales and marketing, did several roles in commercial operations, and then also took some different opportunities in leadership and team development through our human resources, which is actually where I started in AZ. Been in the business now for almost 30 years. So the lion's share of it between a really small biopharma company in Elan Pharma, biopharma, and then to AstraZeneca, which is obviously at the other end of the spectrum. And so we've really transformed as a company from going from what was traditionally a primary care company to what is today really a 50-50 split between primary care and specialty. And so my team that I lead, my team manages the specialty pharmacies that are in network for AstraZeneca and contracted network, and specifically looking at patient services and areas around adherence. So right in line with this opportunity. So thank you, Lyndi.
Well, great. Thank you for that. And I do think that for everyone who's listening today or who will be in the future, it's good to have an idea of really the breadth of experience. When we think about the direction of the pharmaceutical business, and I myself have been in this business for just about 25 years now, and also focusing mainly in marketing, for biotech and pharmaceutical companies. The holy grail of the work that we do is to focus on better health outcomes. And with the treatments that we work on, focusing on those ultimate better health outcomes is really about how to make sure that the patients who we support have the best experience all the way through, even on some of the worst days. And so, when we think about adherence and this journey, this experience, traditionally or historically, there have been different ways to think about this. And I feel like some of our thinking has been right, and some of it has not been right. We've learned, I think, from different ways of focusing on when we should and how we should be thinking about adherence. So I first want to ask Jaymin, and then Jeff, I'm going to go to you. What are your thoughts on the traditional thinking about adherence, and then where are we going today? What does the future of that look like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lyndi. And I'm going to generalize this quite a bit here, but I think based on my experience, adherence has kind of been an afterthought, if you will. We often focus on getting patients on therapy, whether it's switch or a new patient. And, then down the road, we're thinking, okay, well, why are patients dropping off? And often it's not part of our initial thinking, or it hasn't been in my past, at least. And, this a marketer I worked with a long time ago said, we'll fix the leaky bucket later. Let's just get patients on therapy. And I think that's a real big miss for obviously for running a business, for marketers, but most importantly for patients too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when we think about continuums, we think about where adherence sits far down. And when I think about it, I think about all the effort and the investment we make to get somebody onto a therapy. And isn't that really that point, and even points before that? And we're going to talk to Dr. Prussin about that in a second, but even points before that, to think about how we can have an impact of what the way we set people up for success when they get started. And how we anticipate what's coming and what we learn as we get more and more people onto treatment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I want to ask you, your thoughts about that, and thinking about, you're looking at commercially down the line, this integration of adherence programs, but, traditionally the way that we've thought about it versus where your mindset is now. What are the differences? What are you thinking about now versus how you used to look at it?
Yeah, so if we go really traditional from the standpoint of prior to technology, we'd be thinking about the types of calls and outreach that would happen from the specialty pharmacy, outreaching and touching to the patient. At the end of the day, you really think about it as every patient's really being treated the same way. And that sounds great, and it does work. It's better than not having the outreach to patients. But today, looking at the advances that have come from technology and smartphones and everything else that's out there, remote patient monitoring, it's if you're not integrating those things, then at least in my humble opinion, I think you're missing an opportunity to overlay the human interaction with also the possibility of additional wraparound services that can be helped through technology, which in my opinion, I don't think you're ever going to know if a patient's taking a medication or not without some type of a way to actually measure that.
Right. Right. And it's a good transition into talking to Dr. Prussin about adherence strategies and when to introduce the view of how adherence can impact the overall treatment. And so since you focused in on clinical trials, and I know that one of your very important points when we were talking earlier was about minimizing variables so that you could really understand the effectiveness of a medication. I think it's important to think about when we could be thinking about integration of adherence technologies or programming, even in the pre-commercial world. So can you give us some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to jump back one step. And I think just in terms of my interest in this as a physician, as somebody who takes care of patients or has taken care of patients more in previous lives, I was very aware of the fact that when they leave my office, there's a very good chance that they're not going to take this medication. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, and that people that don't take that into account are not taking care of their patients. They're not thinking about the whole patient. And there's so many different steps to getting a prescription filled, or they get it filled, them actually taking it. And there's so many ways they can stumble in that regard. So I do think that, just from a practitioner's point of view, it's a huge part of the practice of medicine should be thinking about adherence. Otherwise, your drugs that you prescribe are a lot less effective. In terms of clinical development, drug development, our interest is, so we have a drug where it's very clear it works in the vast majority of patients, but there's a minority who we get much less drug effect in, and that's called heterogeneity of effect. And that those low responders, we're trying to understand, is that the fact that they're just different, and why are they different? Genetically, are they different, for example? Or is it they're just not taking the medication with the same adherence that the other patients in the clinical trial are? And so to really understand that question and get a whole, and we're in the early stages, right? So we need to really understand this before we move forward, because it impacts how well our drug works, for example, and how we're going to design clinical trials, so how patients are going to use it. And so to take out that variable, we've been using the smart bottles to try to, identify, so they can't actually enter the clinical trial until they've gone through a 2-week, what we call a run-in period, where they've demonstrated in that 2 weeks that they have 85% or greater adherence, which you'd think wouldn't be that hard, but some, occasional patients really just can't get that together even in 2 weeks. And those are not the patients you want to then have on your trial. And then during the trial, we can talk later, we can use a smart bottle to really help inform the nurses and staff about how the patient's doing, and try to give them positive feedback to improve their drug adherence.
Interesting. As you look at that data and that information, do you have the ability to share that information forward? So you're going to have a team of people who are going to be looking at marketing this product, creating educational information, providing information for the physicians' offices. Are you able to carry some of that information through?
When you say carry it through, meaning?
To share it with the commercial team, like sharing it if Jaymin.
Sure. No. So the just like all these internet connected devices, you have incredible details of data. So it's almost what don't you want to share, because there's so much. But in terms of timing and things like that, and so definitely you do. I haven't figure it out so much in terms of the commercial aspect of it, but definitely, and for our drug, the timing of day isn't as big a deal. But for example, Bernard of Riens, who's probably the preeminent adherence researcher in the world, has published a number of papers, and you look and they have very sophisticated figures of looking at adherence based both on missing or taking or late. And all of those, you can imagine a blood pressure medicine that you take late isn't going to be as effective as when you take it on time, or particularly an antibiotic or an antiviral drug, perhaps. So for ours, it's not as big an issue, but yeah, definitely you can get very detailed information from these in terms of time, day, et cetera.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that in just a second, Dr. Prussin. I want to ask Jeff right now, just very similarly about the when of the integration of strategies, and then I want to come back to the real-time data and the information that can be shared and learned from. But Jeff, for you, when we think about integrating strategies, what is the optimum time from your view? You know, you're working, managing a field team that's working with specialty pharmacy. You know, you're talking about the full commercial environment and distribution. So what's the right timing from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. From my perspective, it's as early as possible, and it would be pre-approval of the product, so that, for instance, in the clinical development, if you're finding that there's a certain level of adverse events that are happening earlier on, just as a simple example, that would have implications later on. And so you'd want to have more touch points and wraparound services to support that patient early. And to take it a step further, when that patient's taking the medicine is such a big deal, because as you know, you can take it every day. I could take my medicine daily, and my, let's say Jaymin on the other hand, he's taking it daily too. But when you look more closely, you realize how tightly bound his dosing intervals are compared to mine. That may have an impact, and that could be informative on the back end, that you're saying, hey, Jeff Kahoot is not taking his medication. There are these gaps in time when he's taking it. Why is that? And that it could inform a specialty pharmacy to have a clinician outreach to the patient. And I might give feedback to say, it's everything I can do to take this medicine. Say more about that. And the more you find out, the more you realize that I'm actually having some of these AEs that were early on that might be able to be coached through if possible. And those are the kinds of things that I think a clinical development program would inform the type of wraparound services and even technology that you may deploy once you actually start to launch the drug. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. And Jaymin, I definitely want your thoughts on this, because you're thinking about the development of these programs, and you're thinking about what we have learned, what we know, to anticipate, right? What you're going to put out into the field, what information, what type of support services, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the earlier the better, from everything what my colleagues said. But it's also, I wonder too, if it could actually become a competitive advantage for a product as well. I mean, if you're entering a competitive space and you're differentiating the margins, if adherence is actually thought of an afterthought for a lot of these products, if you can actually build it in early on, can it help things like health economics outcomes? Can it help other things when, if you're going to a payer customer, if you're going to different customers to say, this is why you should cover my product, this is why your patients should be on product, to a healthcare provider, you can actually show positive results from a clinical trial showing that, that a patient is more likely to adhere to your product over the competitor. And I think from a marketing standpoint, the earlier it's brought into, you not only have the benefit of actually help educate patients on when to take a certain therapy, or the consequences of missing a dose, but it can also become maybe a competitive advantage for your product as well.
Yeah, it's a really good thought, and the idea of the planning and the time that it takes to get there and when to integrate it is really an important consideration. I know that we talk a lot about just the overall health outcomes. If you think about a clinical trial and the information that you're providing to the FDA, and if you have an adherence technology arm versus not, and you're seeing such a difference, like what can that do, especially in a competitive environment, with how you put that product into the market. And so I want to talk about these points that we can identify. And I first want to go to Dr. Prussin about this, since he's worked in a clinical trial environment, in particular with the AdhereTech technology, but in general, the information that you're kind of looking for, like the different areas that you want to know about that are important to identify for early intervention and understanding what this course of experience on treatment is going to be like for a patient. And what types of information, Dr. Prussin, are you looking for and can be provided with technology today?
Right. So we get several different layers of information. So one is every day, if a patient, so we have about over 100 patients in our clinical trial, relatively small in the scheme of things, but we get every patient a master email of all the patients who missed a dose that last 24 hours, but every site in the clinical trial gets if one of theirs. So you sort of get this stream of information, and you're sort of seeing that. And obviously everyone misses one dose. That's not a big deal, but it's the pattern. And so what we also, you can do is say, you see a patient, oh, they've missed a few from those emails or just from checking. They're sort of on the AdhereTech portal. You can just go through and see all of the patients in the trial. And if there are any red marks where they've missed, you say, are there a bunch of red marks together? Oh, let me take a closer look at that. And then you drill down and you can see a calendar. I can show you, I did a screenshot yesterday of one as an example. But you know, that calendar has been very helpful at several levels. One, it's helpful for us to look at it, but that's really our primary feedback to the patients. This, you know, what we don't want to do is be big brother and tell them we're watching over you all the time. What we're trying to do is help them. They join the clinical trial. They're there, for example, a patient. They want to be good and be successful with this medication. And so the real challenge is helping them in that regard. And so showing them that calendar and just looking at it and say, well, where do you see those red dots? Where did you miss? And they say, oh yeah, like I miss in the mornings a lot because I'm running out the door late, or I miss on the weekend mornings because I've been out late having a good time. And helping them identify it and coming up with solutions. Oh yeah, you know, I have the bottle in the cupboard, and so you say, well, if you put it out on the countertop, you'd see it blinking. And I can show you I set mine up to blink now, so I can show you. So here, if you look at a device and see the LED, will come on and sort of just should go on. I just look, oh, there, see, so it sort of does that just very quietly in the background. And so I come in the morning and I see the thing I've been using for about 3 years for my own. And you just sort of see it out of the corner of your eye, blinking like that very quietly. And you say, oh yeah, I got to take my medication. And that's the kind of signal we want to be giving. There's something, it's subtle, but it's enough that you see it. And I promise you that if I don't see that, I just forget about it and go on my day, but I'm just sort of out of sight, out of mind. But something like that for a patient like me is actually very helpful. There are other people who don't need these, but I found it incredibly valuable just as a personal user.
Yeah. Thank you for showing the bottle. And for those who are listening who don't have familiarity with our smart pill bottle, the bottle blinks and then it will chime, and then you'll receive a text or a phone call if you haven't opened it up to take your medication. And what we found interestingly during through this time, especially early in the pandemic, is that people were taking their medicines earlier, and in fact taking it at the time even before it would light up, or during the time that it was lighting up. And as we looked into it further, it's because, you know, people were home, they weren't rushing around to get out the door. So it's very interesting the things that can trigger people and how to set up this information so that it can be effective. So
hey, Lyndi, can I just make a comment off what Dr. Prussin said also?
Absolutely.
You know, I think as a marketer, like hearing what you just said actually makes me really excited about the ability to create that relationship with the patient right out the gate at launch. You know, that's what it's all about. It's not about, and you know, it's about turning that kind of big brother, what it could be, that a big brother approach into how could we help you?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many times, you know, I've been on products where I've marketed products where they, you know, launched several years ago. And every couple of years, we're updating the patient journey to understand what are the points of drop off, why are people dropping off. as a marketer, to have that information right out the gate would actually help me design a program tailored to the patient that are going to be on these medicines right away. And I think that's just going to make it even more rich.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying, because, and you and I have talked about this a lot as colleagues, that there's a holy grail of marketing here, to understand the best way to keep in communication without being in somebody's face, you know, or being annoying or crossing a line that people don't want you to cross. And it's different for each individual. But this idea of this holy grail is being able to understand in real time what's going on at the point that a patient leaves a doctor's office with a prescription in hand, you know, may or may not fill it. And if they do fill it, what's going on between those visits. And so I want to talk to both Jaymin and Jeff about this right now. And Jaymin, you have said previously the importance of this two-way dialogue. So really to plan what you were just saying, that ability to establish a two-way dialogue where we can provide with technology, not just our own, real-time information that allows us to impact outcomes and impact that experience. Can you talk to that a little bit, Jaymin? And then Jeff, I'm going to go to you, because you did talk about just a little bit ago, this, you know, this point of identifying when something's happening and how to coach through and how to manage. So I want to talk about that next.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what the doctor was saying, I mean, to me, the ability to actually integrate that into marketing efforts, to me, that's like one step closer to that holy grail you just mentioned. It's around, you know, really, like, you know, I think one of the panelists actually mentioned blood pressure medication, asymptomatic, you know, condition. A lot of patients may not realize why they should take it at the same time every day, whether it's in the morning, what the dangers of taking it at night are. You're not going to get that benefit. And if you can start to see early on that that's a habit some patients have, you can start to, again, build the materials, build the relationship, build those points of contact in to let people know at the end of the day, here's the WIFM, what's in it for them in terms of taking the medication at a certain time. What are the consequences if they actually miss a dose or take it at night, let's say? And this is just all these things. If you can get these insights early, it's a huge, in my mind, competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just think about the difference in the health outcomes, the longer term that someone's going to stay healthier on your product, and the ability to develop communications that can have that impact in real time. So Jeff, let's talk about that for a second, because that integration, that timeliness of information to be able to intervene when it's appropriate, how important is that to managing your business?
Well, it's huge, because again, outside of a technology, I don't know how you'd know. And so in a case like ours, where we have a medication where if the patient's not taking it within the time-bound interval, they actually shouldn't take it. So they need to get it the next day. And so by having something technologically like AdhereTech, the smart bottle, be able to know that that patient was over the 3 hours, and somebody indicated earlier, if it's a pattern, and that did occur, then the outreach is in this case, it's not AdhereTech necessarily, doesn't mean they can't, but they're working with the specialty pharmacy in this case. So the outreach is to the SP is to the patient. And to the points made earlier about the relationship, if that specialty pharmacy happens to have the same nurse or pharmacist that is typically assigned to that patient, if that's the level of service that you have, then you have this relationship where there is a partnership, and it's essentially their health coach that's helping coach them along as to what's happening. Why is that? Is there something else we should be considering? And then, you've got a patient who's now back on therapy, and as they should be, but understanding why it's so critical to have it taken in that time-bound period that was as prescribed. And as you know, there's a lot of information that's conveyed to a patient, especially if they've just been diagnosed with something like cancer. They may have been told, but they may not have heard most of what has been said, especially if you've just gotten a diagnosis for cancer or some other debilitating disease. So it's you have to put yourself in the patient's shoes and really think about that. Where would they get that level of, essentially partnership without something like a technology and the SP or some other means that's reaching out to that patient?
Yeah. Dr. Prussin, thank you so much for that, Jeff. Dr. Prussin, what are your thoughts about the time frames, especially when there might be tight time frames like Jeff is talking about, windows to take medication, time when you shouldn't take medication any longer? you talk to us a little bit about that and the importance of organizing that and knowing what's going on?
Right. So again, I think both in terms of adverse events, stacking medication upon dose, because you take one late and one early, and you might have more adverse events. And so you're trying to avoid that. But the flip side is also efficacy. If you have these gaps where the patient doesn't have therapeutic amounts of drug in their system because they missed a day, and sort of putting that big picture as you understand the drug. So all of that, I think, goes into it. But I think going back to some of those I think Jaymin was talking about, building these relationships with the patient. One of the things we've talked about is trying to make it sort of more fun and gamification of this. And like it's sort of like, I saw one of the comments was, I haven't seen the movie Minority Report, but I'm assuming it's some kind of 1984 Big Brother is watching you. And I think that's it. You want to have the patient be part of this experience. And so making it more like, they get, a medal when they have, 20 doses in a row, or the next time it's 30. So they're competing with themselves, not thinking, oh God, this person's going to bother, is watching over me. But really, just like when, people with these Fitbits or other apps are sitting there and they get, I did 5,000 steps today, or I did a 30-mile bike ride, that's, I think, one way to, in a very positive way, use these kinds of tools. And ultimately, the end result is good health, I think, and taking the medication the way it's supposed to be taken. Yeah. And just little nudges in that direction make a huge difference in terms of public health. And that's really what we're ultimately trying to get, is people healthier.
Yeah, and it's a very good segue into the next topic I wanted to focus in on, which is about data integration. And so I love this theme that we can make this more fun or more competitive for yourself, and it can be highly competitive or not as competitive, just like other technologies allow for, wearables, other type of feedback that you can get. And what we talk about at AdhereTech is taking what could be traditionally in adherence more reminder type of messaging and information to true adherence messaging, which is motivating, it's inspiring, it helps you understand what it means with what you're doing. And I see some good nodding. So Dr. Prussin, let's start with you in your thoughts about that, because we did have this conversation around gamification, but what about this data integration? Who needs to see it? How important is it to be able to understand what's going on?
I think that really depends on the situation. And again, specialty pharma drugs that may that are very expensive, that may be, one set of individuals. Whereas, you can imagine going forward, this is something where, somebody at in private practice, or even a patient just on their own decided to, with their own, I mean, you can buy some smart bottles, or at least you could before COVID-19 interrupted the supply chain, on Amazon. So, different, obviously some are smarter than others, but still, I think there are many different levels of which the data could be available. So it really, I think, is situation dependent. But I think the key thing is making the patient comfortable with that level, obviously, and then using it, harnessing it in the most sort of appropriate and to the greatest advantage in terms of how you're using it.
Yeah.
But I think both Jeff and Jaymin probably have a better sense of, in the sort of non-clinical trials world, the real world of how this stuff can be used.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know both Jaymin and Jeff were nodding their heads when I was just talking about, the way to integrate and keep people motivated. Jaymin, what are your thoughts around that data integration, being able to see information in real time and what you can do with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, if you see things in real time, the way technology is now, you can actually message in real time. And at the end of the day, marketing is, the right message to the right person at the right frequency. Mm-hmm. And this is, if we had real-time data suggesting, someone was missing doses or was, non-compliant in some way, shape, or form, to be able to actually customize that message now in a pretty cost-effective way, whether it's through a text message or email or some sort of digital medium. Everyone's on their phones nowadays. That to me is really powerful.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jaymin. I think, when we think about just the overall ways to communicate, it's interesting to know that there are some people who still have landlines, right? And there are some people, and the majority of people, who live off of texting. And then we have some people who are looking at more advanced channels and actually use different forms of apps and programming. And so it's really interesting in designing this with technology. It can be very cost effective and easy to actually now span multiple demographics and be able to communicate in real time in a very effective way through the channels that are effective.
Yeah, I mean, Lyndi, when we worked together, I guess a decade ago now, maybe a little more, we were doing snail mail, we were using email, we weren't texting at the time, but now to be able to do this across a variety of different platforms, I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah, it can definitely have an impact. Thank you for that. Jeff, your thoughts on data integration in particular, because you're spanning from, what's going on field distribution with programming like this, right? Where you know that there's information that's being shared and gathered by specialty pharmacies, through to, what is the marketing team, what's the internal team going to do with that information? As this information's coming in real time, what are your thoughts on that data integration, and who needs to see it when?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, certainly the brand teams are highly integrated, and as you would well expect. And the difference between what you've seen in your clinical trials versus the real world, with real world evidence, the ability back to this, understanding and seeing things real time is a whole different ballgame, because it can change the way that you end up. You may build a program, a support and adherence program, to what you think it's going to be based on what you saw in the clinical trials. How do we best support that patient? And then in the real world, because you've now got this level of data and integration, providing you're using it as insight, right? We all buy a lot of data. Whether or not you're using it for something insightful is a different story. But if you're using it that way and it's informing you, it may actually affect the way that your current services program, is being deployed. You may shape it differently as a result of that. And I've seen that, which has been, very helpful, for us. I think the other thing, and I think, Lyndi, you were hinting at this or saying it earlier, is that, you have to meet a patient where they are. So if a patient is being segmented based on how they like to communicate, or even for that matter, the level of risk they have to being non-adherent, if those kinds of insights are gathered on the front end, then it may actually inform how you're going to support that patient. And as I said earlier, you may not support every patient the same, because there's not a need to do that based on what you've been informed on the front end. But again, those are things you have to constantly monitor. And as I've said, repeatedly, and I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, outside of technology, I don't know how you'd have that insight.
Yeah.
Just to touch on that, I think the real-time capability is amazing, because then you can have a nurse, a study coordinator, like a research nurse, just call up, who has a relationship with the patient, call up and say, hey, I noticed you didn't take your meds for a couple of days. Everything okay? And, and you can get all sorts of answers, but it's something where you can really check in and not wait, till their next clinic visit 30 days later to find out, I stopped taking it because it's giving me this adverse event or something like that. So I think that's a huge advantage to these real-time, systems, so you can see, immediately who, when people have adherence problems.
Yeah, and that being able to understand what's happening in that moment and coach through what that moment is, and to hopefully then lead that patient and support that patient through to the next best decision, whatever that means. And what is most important is their health and the outcomes to that. And I think about how many patients are left with 30, 45, 60, 90 days, maybe 6 months to a year before even seeing a healthcare professional again. And they might have made a decision about their treatment at home long before that visit happens. And that next conversation, when someone's not doing very well or something else is wrong, is going back now, what happened back when you decided to stop taking your medication or to change something. And so that the real time, the ability to use technology is incredibly important here for that type of communication. I want to go back to something Jeff said, because it was in the prep call we were talking about this, that I said, you know, we used to be in the world of disruption, right? When we would integrate treatment from a pharmaceutical perspective, you know, either launching it or working on campaigns and programs to educate and support patients. We used to believe that we had to cut through a significant amount of clutter. And what's interesting about that from years ago is that there's more clutter and more information today. But Jeff's point of what I was saying there was that now we have to fit into people's lifestyles and be where they are and speak to them in those terms. And, you know, unfortunately, with the country being in this pandemic for this amount of time, we talked about for years people managing their healthcare around their kitchen table. That's really happening today, right? We're seeing this now with telemedicine visits and that being more in place, but having that disconnect more where technology is even more important. And so I want to talk a little bit about barriers and challenges to integration. And I want to start first with like that pre-commercial view of that. If you're thinking about integrating a good adherence program, and we'll talk about that from a clinical trial perspective. So Dr. Prussin, what do you think about with the obstacles to get a good program in place to be able to move forward? And then we'll talk about it with Jaymin and Jeff from a commercial perspective.
Right. So sort of being, you know, sort of wide, you know, looking at it broadly, you know, there's a lot of different adherence advices. And we talked about these smart bottles, but they're actually, so I work in asthma and allergic diseases. And so they're actually inhaler devices that are also similarly adherence enabled. And they can actually not only detect whether the, you know, so in clinical trials in the past, when you had these devices and you check, what you found was that a lot of patients, I shouldn't say, some patients wouldn't use their medicine during the, you know, the 30 days since their last visit. They'd come to the clinic and spray off like 20 puffs into the air just before walking into clinic. So, because they knew that it was going to be counted. They just didn't know that you actually had a timestamp as well. And so, but now that there's devices where you can actually have more real-time data, that you can certainly intervene in that. They also have, again, these smart inhaler adherence devices that it listens to the inhalation sound. And it can actually say, oh, this person's doing a good inhalation, or it's not an adequate inhalation for inhaling, you know, a inhaled asthma medication. So some of it is on the front end, working with staff just to teach them how to use these things. I think that's a big part of it. Training, and then training patients how to use them as well, because you know, it does add a bit more complexity, particularly, you know, for some populations more than other older patients are not as familiar with technology. But I think on the whole, it's and also, how are you going to use it? What are you going to, you're generating data. What are you using it for? Ultimately, you know, you want to begin with the end in mind. What is the purpose of this? It's not just to have technology. It's to address some specific question or some specific issue. So really trying to identify in your patient population and in your disease that your drug is treating, what you're trying to do with that. And I think that differs from disease to disease and population to population.
Sure. And certainly amongst demographics, right? We talk about programs today where we're working in pediatrics with caregivers who need to be taught, but they also want to teach the children, right? And depending on their age, you know, will the child be more responsible, all the way through to older populations who also may need support or might have, or even diseases, not just by age, memory issues or dexterity issues. So when you think about that, and you think about the barriers of integration, how successful have you been with the implementation of technology, and what are some good learnings with your implementation that will help us think about, you know, future ways to integrate programming?
We haven't, it's been very smooth. There haven't been, I hate to say it, there have not been a lot of barriers really. I, everyone pretty much has been, on board, and I've gotten good feedback from the nurses and clinical staff using them. I haven't had one-on-one conversations with patients, so I can't tell you that, but I haven't heard anything negative in that regard. And I can certainly, so I brought this device into our company with there was a lot of skepticism there, but I just said, you got to trust me on this. And I think when the data started coming out and people started seeing it, I think there's really been a lot of acceptance from our CEO, from other operations staff. So it's been pretty smooth. I haven't had a lot of bumps in the road. I've been very pleasantly surprised.
Well, good. I thank you for that. I mean, your feedback on just the motivational aspect of this is very helpful, because we think about more programs that can fit seamlessly and easily integrated into people's lives, thinking about motivating factors and how to do that across demographics, it's important for us to be getting that feedback and understand that, because that will continue for us and others who are looking within the adherence technology industry, how to continue to make these programs better for overall better health outcomes. I want to ask Jaymin now, from your perspective, when we think about the barriers to integration of good adherence programming, whether it be general communications programming, integration of technology, what are some of those barriers that you've experienced, and what's some good advice to overcome them, even if you feel like you haven't always been able to overcome them, as sometimes there are challenges that can be a little bit insurmountable to bringing programs forward?
Yeah, I think from an industry standpoint, I think the biggest barriers have been, especially if you think about adherence sort of as an afterthought or downstream, really trying to understand then the patient journey, what are the reasons for poor adherence or non-compliance, and then making reasonable assumptions off of that, and actually trying to build a CRM program kind of to hit those gaps. I think with technology and this data, this could be it's almost like perfect data, which is kind of the Holy Grail too. You can actually really make true customized messages and like Jeff said, meet the patient where they're at, whether it's an email or a text message or snail mail or on whatever platform. I think that's from kind of the biggest barrier from the industry standpoint. I think on a patient standpoint, the biggest barrier from my experience is just lack of knowledge, or just really not understanding why it's important to take every dose, whether it's an antibiotic or a blood pressure medication, or even something for rheumatoid arthritis, for example. I mean, missing a dose, like the doctor said, I mean, maybe it's not a huge deal if you miss one dose, but you start missing, it becomes a pattern, then that becomes a big deal. And really, if it's a disease that has really slow progression, or if it's something that's asymptomatic, I don't think they really understand the importance or the significance of missing that dose. And so I think, the more we can actually really try to understand those insights and understand what the barriers are from a patient perspective, and tailor our messages to that's been where I've seen success.
Yeah, and that tailoring can really happen in real time when you're collecting this data, being able to feed this data. Like, I think about patients who half doses, right? And and whatever's driving that, they feel okay, or they have accessibility issues around cost, and being able to provide that information of, if you want the best health outcomes, here's why, or if you don't want this type of side effect, or, whatever that feedback is, can be tailored in real time and done really at a cost-effective way, right? Because you can reach out directly to the individual who's having this experience. You don't have to segment and break things out, and by texting or sending, general information through technology channels, it can be quick, easy, and very effective.
And one more barrier too, Lyndi, on the industry side, and this actually is semi-related to a question that came in. Every manufacturer, and Jeff can speak to this probably better than me, but every manufacturer has a hub. And so often we're finding, a lot of patients just work right directly with an SP. If there's not that link between hub and SP, the patients aren't going to get the full benefit, in my opinion.
Right.
because the hub, a manufacturer hub is going to really try to, help the patient exhaust all options on copay programs, different things of that nature. And so, SPs may not. And so that's a barrier too, is how do you actually create that seamless integration with all this technology and all these services from hub to SP to practitioner to patient.
Yeah. That's a great segue to Jeff to talk about how that can be done, since that is his main focus, from a business perspective. So Jeff, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And we have a hub. Our hub is internal, so there is some advantage to that, as you can appreciate. I was going to say, as far as the integration, the key, in my opinion, with the work that we've done, Lyndi, with you and your team, would be that the integration with the SP has been really critical. And I think, so if you really think about this from a patient standpoint, the number of contacts that can be at an outreach to a patient, you get that patient abrasion, right? Where there's so many different outreaches, it can go the opposite way, which is too much, right? And so you have a hub that may be outreaching to the patient, you have the SP. If in this case we had AdhereTech, if, for instance, if that were the case, or some other technology that was an outreach, that's where the integration really has to be seamless. And where it is, and I feel like that's been the case, because AdhereTech's been very much integrated with the SP that we're using through this program. It's the SP that's got the outreach, but the person behind the curtain with the insight may be AdhereTech providing that, so that there's some heads up that, as I indicated earlier, one of the medications where if they're not taken in a tightly bound window, there's an alert. And to the point earlier about, well, do you feel like Big Brother? But it's in the art of the way that healthcare practitioner is outreaching to the patient. And I think that that's been done. So at least my opinion and observation has been the integration has been pretty seamless. And as a result of it, we seem to be seeing some really good outcomes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And when I think about integration and the seamless integration, I do think about what we've discussed: meeting people where they are, being able to understand what their issue is, and the way that we can collect data and respond to it today. It's not like it was even 5 years ago, where you had to focus on a segment, where you were able to tailor education to that segment. Here we can customize and we can be very responsive. That's what technology allows us to do. And the smarter technology is, the smarter we are, and the more effective it is to be in real time, the smarter we are and more responsive we can be, and open up that two-way dialogue in a way that really integrates into a person's personal life, that's not invasive, but supports the efforts that they're making for their own well-being and managing their healthcare. So in just the last couple of minutes, we have a couple of questions that came in. So I just want to put the questions out there. So the first one is, medication adherence is a huge problem, especially with older people and chronic condition patients. However, I often think of Minority Report. So Dr. Prussin referred to that earlier. The movie. How much or how far should this technology go? So Jeff, we'll start with you. What do you think about how far this technology should go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think like that idea that you're being watched, that could have a negative connotation. So if the experience is more about understanding and doing it in an artful form of who's making that outreach, if, for instance, somebody's non-adherent, and in our case, working through the SP, it's the SP that's got the outreach. And in this case, if it's their nurse and it's actually a relationship, and I think that my colleagues had indicated this earlier, you're building a relationship over time. So if it's that person they've got a trusted relationship with, and it's the same one, that's not always the case. It can be, if that's the level of service you're, from an enhanced service that you go to, then it does create something very different from a patient to healthcare practitioner bond. And if it's done in that manner, I think it's proven to be very successful, at least from what we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Prussin, what are your thoughts about that? How far should technology go? I
mean, obviously, patients are going to need to be comfortable with this and buy into it. So in that sense, I think it's on a per, for example, in a clinical trial, if you join a clinical trial, you sign a consent, and as part of that, that's part of the clinical trial is the smart bottle. But I think it's also, I agree there, we're so connected, there is that concern. But the flip side is, we as a society are putting a lot of resources into paying for these medications. Some of these medications are quite expensive from specialty pharmacies, and we as a society are paying for that. And I think we as a society also need to be assured that these medications are actually going to make this person more healthy, because that's why, we have insurance. It's we all buy into it and we all get something out of it. And so I think it is I think it's a reasonable thing to try, to ask somebody who's being reimbursed for a very expensive medication, for example, as some of the hepatitis antiviral drugs, to say, hey, we'd like you to use this so we can help you, and monitor you and help keep you compliant, because that's not going to cure your hepatitis if you're not adherent. And then at the end of it, we both lost. You haven't cured your hepatitis, and our insurance company has shelled out God knows how much money. And so it's like lose-lose. So
Right.
so as much as I do think we need to be very sensitive to privacy issues, the flip side is we also need to be sensitive to limited healthcare resources as a society and using them as efficiently as possible. And I think these types of devices can help in that regard.
Thank you for that. So Jaymin, in the last moments here, and then I will hit very quickly on the last question, but thoughts on how far technology should go?
I mean, I agree with what everybody said. I mean, and from my standpoint too, just being like a brand team standpoint, anybody we market to has to opt in and actually request, to be part of our service and whatnot. And so then, ideally we're actually only speaking to people that actually want that type of information. So I think that kind of helps reduce the big brother component. But like the doctor just said, when you're talking about Hep C or something like that, if the patient understands that the cure is at the end, and if you miss a dose, or if you keep on skipping doses, you're not going to get cured. Kind of, again, it's what's in it for the patient. Why is it so important? I think that the vast majority of patients would welcome that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I'm going to quickly answer this question around whether the medication adherence vendor or provider is responsible for access. What's important here, at least from our perspective, is that we are partnered within the services that provide the support around access, whether that be through the SP or whether that be through a hub, make sure that patients understand that process. Generally, that doesn't fall in our respect to a provider or a partner for the patient itself, but getting them to the place to get that information would be part of our responsibility. I want to thank the three of you today. This was such a great conversation. I could talk to you guys for hours about this stuff. I love it. And I look forward to continuing to solve these issues together. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndi. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Calman. Thank you so much, Jaymin. Thank you all for joining us here today. I also want to give a hearty thank you to our summit sponsors, AdhereTech, as well as the AdhereTech team that is behind the scenes. You won't see them on the screen today, but Whitney Salamone and Chantal Colbert were a huge part of making all this possible. And we're eternally grateful to everyone at the AdhereTech team for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Talking with you.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. So up next, we'll be